Hi, this is Mahavan Das. Welcome to Simple Gita, chapter 14. This chapter is entitled The Three Modes of Material Nature. Let's take a look at the connection between it and the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, Krishna described that the spirit soul accepts the disadvantages of birth and death due to association with the three modes of material nature. So in this chapter, he explains what those modes are, how they bind, and how they can give liberation. A short overview of chapter 14. In this chapter we hear how the living entity is conditioned by material nature, specifically its three varieties or modes. We learn how to recognize those modes, the various ways they control us, the symptoms of one who has transcended their influence, and the process of doing that. Let's take a look at the first verse and purport for this chapter from Bhagavad Gita as it is. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "Again I shall declare to you the supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge, knowing which all the sages have attained the supreme perfection." Here's Srila Prabhupada's purport. From the 7th chapter to the end of the 12th chapter, Sri Krishna in detail reveals the absolute truth, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Now the Lord himself is further enlightening Arjuna. If one understands this chapter through the process of philosophical speculation, he will come to an understanding of devotional service. In the 13th chapter, it was clearly explained that by humbly developing knowledge, one may possibly be freed from material entanglement. It has also been explained that it is due to association with the modes of nature that the living entity is entangled in this material world. Now, in this chapter, the Supreme Personality explains what those modes of nature are, how they act, how they bind, and how they give liberation. The knowledge explained in this chapter is proclaimed by the Supreme Lord to be superior to the knowledge given so far in other chapters. By understanding this knowledge, various great sages attained perfection and transferred to the spiritual world. The Lord now explains the same knowledge in a better way. This knowledge is far, far superior to all other processes of knowledge thus far explained, and knowing this, many attained perfection. Thus, it is expected that one who understands this 14th chapter will attain perfection. The key points for this chapter. We first hear about the conditioning of the soul by these three modes of material nature. First, Krishna glorifies the knowledge he will speak in texts 1 and 2. We've heard text 1. And in text 2, he says, by becoming fixed in this knowledge, one can attain to the transcendental nature like my own. Thus established, one is not born at the time of creation or disturbed at the time of dissolution. So Krishna has done this in previous chapters 7, 9, and 10. At the beginning of those chapters, he glorifies the knowledge he will speak before speaking that knowledge. Again, he does that here in chapter 14. And then he explains the soul's contact with material nature, how the soul comes to the material world, and he compares material nature to a mother and himself to a seed-giving father. So he puts the seeds of the living entities into the mother-like material nature, and in this way they take their material birth. Then we hear how the three modes of nature bind the soul. So what actually happens when the soul contacts material nature? Krishna says material nature consists of three modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. When the eternal living entity comes in contact with nature, O mighty Arjuna, he becomes conditioned by these modes. So that's what happens to the soul when it contacts material nature. It becomes conditioned specifically by these three modes of nature: goodness, passion, and ignorance. So what does it mean to become conditioned? by the three modes of nature. Conditioned means controlled or bound. The Sanskrit word for mode, in the context of a mode of nature, is guna. And one of the meanings of this word guna is quality, and another meaning is rope. So a rope is something that binds. It controls, it restricts the freedom of someone or something. And in exactly the same way, these three modes of nature, they control the spirit soul. They restrict the freedom of the soul. Remember in chapter 3, at the beginning of chapter 3, Krishna explained that we're all forced to act helplessly according to the qualities we've acquired from the modes of material nature, and therefore no one can refrain from doing something, not even for a moment. So here we get in this chapter an expanded understanding of what that text means. It means that we're bound by our particular body and forced to act accordingly. Our particular body is a creation of nature, material nature, but specifically these three modes, and one of those modes will be predominant in our particular body, and we're forced by the body to act according to that mode. We're forced to act in a certain way or ways. We're forced to think in certain ways. So this is what it means to be conditioned by material nature, or these three modes. Conditioning by the three modes also means that we're subjected to many unwanted conditions. In an existential sense, those conditions were explained in the previous chapter as four. There's birth, there's death, there's old age, and there's disease. These are not natural conditions for the soul to experience. The soul by nature is unborn, never dies, never experiences old age or disease, but because of contact with these modes of nature, these unwanted conditions are imposed upon the soul. The primary condition, though, and the basis of all the other conditions, including those four that I just mentioned, is that we forget our spiritual identity and we forget our relationship with the Supreme. So our consciousness is conditioned or bound to that forgetfulness. That is the prime symptom of conditioning by the three modes of nature. We forget who we really are and what our eternal function is in relation to the Supreme. We'll also hear in this chapter and in the 16th chapter how the soul is conditioned to a certain quality of experience by these three modes. Because guna also means quality. So each of these modes offers a certain quality of experience. And it also imposes certain qualities on the soul. So that's another way that we can understand being conditioned by material nature. We are conditioned or bound to certain qualities of experience, or a certain quality of experience, and certain qualities. And again, as I said, we'll hear more about that, particularly in the 16th chapter where Krishna explains the divine and the demoniac natures. So these three modes are called in Sanskrit sattva, rajas, and tamas. And in English, we translate that as sattva is translated as goodness, rajas as passion, and tamas as ignorance. Let's take a look at Krishna's succinct description of how each mode binds the soul with a certain quality of consciousness and experience. First, Krishna explains bondage by the mode of goodness, sattva guna. He says that this mode is the purest of the three, and I suppose you would expect that with a name like goodness. It's illuminating, and it frees one from the reactions of negative karma and the various types of sufferings that come along through performing negative karma. And how does it bind the soul, or how does it condition the soul? What is the soul's experience? It's actually an experience of happiness. Krishna says that the mode of goodness binds one to happiness, that's one's experience, and also knowledge. That's the quality of life. It's a life based on happiness and knowledge. Now we may think, wow, that sounds great. How is that a type of bondage? I'd love to be happy and to have knowledge. But this happiness is not real happiness, and the knowledge is also not complete. So, as long as one is bound by this kind of happiness and knowledge, one still has to experience the disadvantages of birth, death, old age, and disease. The next mode is Rajaguna, the mode of passion. How is it that the mode of passion conditions or binds the soul? Krishna says that this mode of passion is born of selfish desire. You may remember that at the end of the 3rd chapter, Krishna explained that is actually what pushes people to do things even when they don't want to do them, even when they know they're not the right thing to do. This selfish desire generated from the mode of passion. So that experience is symptomatic of the mode of passion, that just being absorbed in selfish desires, whether they're just one's own desires or desires for other people's selfishness. And basically, one's experience of life in the mode of passion is being attached to what one has and longing for what one doesn't have. And how are you bound in the mode of passion? You're bound to perform material activities or karmic activities, because if you have a lot of desires, selfish desires, to fulfill, that requires work. You have to work very hard to fulfill your selfish desires, or even the selfish desires of others. So, in that way, you're bound by this mode of passion to perform material activities, to try to fulfill your desires. Then we have bondage by the mode of ignorance. The mode of ignorance is called in Sanskrit tamaguna. Krishna says about this mode that it's the delusion of all embodied living entities. Now, all embodied living entities are deluded, and as I mentioned earlier, the primary delusion that we have is forgetfulness of our spiritual identity and our relationship to the Supreme. So the experience of someone who is bound predominantly by the mode of ignorance is forgetfulness of spiritual existence, spiritual life, and one's real calling in life. And interestingly, Krishna says that one is bound to madness when one is affected predominantly by the mode of ignorance. One is bound to madness. Madness is synonymous with just having no interest in any higher topics. Indolence or laziness and sleep. So this is bondage by the mode of ignorance. So in summary, Krishna says about these three modes, O son of Bharata, the mode of goodness conditions one to happiness. Passion conditions one to fruit of action, and ignorance, covering one's knowledge, binds one to madness. Now, in the next section of the chapter, we hear about how to recognize the prominence of a particular mode of nature. How do we know which mode is controlling us? We got some description there previously, but Krishna will give more details as the chapter goes on. So in this next section, he explains how we can know which mode is controlling us, because the modes are not stable, he explains. They're always changing and shifting. They're always actually competing for domination of our consciousness. So how do we know which one is dominating our consciousness, which one's caught our attention at a particular time and place? Srila Prabhupada explains that by the manifestation of particular activities, it can be understood in what mode of nature one is situated. So it's actually very easy to understand. You just look at your activities or the activities of others, and then you can understand which mode of nature is in charge there. So Krishna explains again, mode by mode, the manifestations of those modes in terms of one's activities. He says the manifestation of the mode of goodness can be experienced when all the gates of the body are illuminated by knowledge. So the body is often compared to a city that has 9 gates. In other words, there are 9 apertures in our body, 9 holes, the 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, mouth, genitals and anus. And these are compared to gates. A gate is something that lets things in or out of a particular place. So what this means in this text here, that when all the gates of the body are illuminated by knowledge, one can understand the manifestation of the mode of goodness. And what this means is that when one knows what to let in and out, basically, of the different gates of the body, one can experience the mode of goodness. And that means that one has accurate perception, one has discrimination, and one has proper action. And thus one is happy in the relative sense due to contact with the mode of goodness. Remember, Krishna explained that's the experience of someone in the mode of goodness. They have happiness and they have knowledge. And actually the happiness is due to the knowledge. So that knowledge is what to let in and out of the various gates of the body. What to see, what not to see, what to hear, what not to hear, what to taste, what not to taste, etc. When you know that, then you can arrange your lifestyle accordingly and you will experience the mode of goodness and therefore be happy in the relative sense. Basically, this lifestyle looks like, you could summarize it as simple living and high thinking. Now, this is very rarely seen today. You'll hardly ever find people today who are firmly situated in this mode of goodness. But closer to home, we have something you will see a lot of. We have the main thrust of modern society, which is the mode of passion. So in the next verse, Krishna explains that. O chief of the Bhartas, when there is an increase in the mode of passion, the symptoms of great attachment, fruitive activity, intense endeavour, and uncontrollable desire and hankering develop. So this is how you can understand the manifestation of the mode of passion, and Srila Prabhupada gives a very nice explanation here of that in his purport. He says, one in the mode of passion is never satisfied with the position he has already acquired. He hankers to increase his position. If he wants to construct a residential house, he tries his best to have a palatial house, as if he would be able to reside in that house eternally. And he develops a great hankering for sense gratification. There is no end to sense gratification. He always wants to remain with his family and in his house and continue the process of sense gratification. There is no cessation of this. All these symptoms should be understood as characteristic of the mode of passion. So someone in the mode of passion is never satisfied with what they've achieved, where they are, who they're with. Just, you can think consumerism and becoming an achiever. That's basically the mode of passion. And then we have the mode of ignorance, the manifestations of the mode of ignorance. Krishna says, when there is an increase in the mode of ignorance, O son of Kuru, darkness, inertia, madness, and illusion are manifested. So, in the mode of ignorance, you basically have the opposite of the mode of goodness. Whereas the mode of goodness was illuminating, the mode of ignorance is the opposite. You get darkness and inertia. There's not even any real endeavour on the ordinary platform for selfish desires. So discrimination and endeavour are absent even in the ordinary sense. You can think intoxication, addiction, social dysfunction, personal dysfunction, etc. That's the manifestation of the mode of ignorance. Such a person doesn't even have material goals, what to speak of any spiritual ones. So, modern society is basically a combination of passion and ignorance. That means, you may have heard the old saying, work, buy, consume, die. That sums it up quite nicely. You have a lot of selfish desires, so you work hard, get money, buy what you think will satisfy your desires, consume it, and then in terms of dying, just don't worry about it. Just forget about it. Just pretend it's not going to exist. Dying can also mean in the sense of work, get money, buy, consume, and die by getting intoxicated and sleeping a lot and trying to forget all the stress that you took on from so much hard work. The next key points here we have are more about the effect of conditioning by the modes. So both the results of one's actions and the destination one achieves after one's death are controlled by a specific mode of nature, and thus they bring certain results. So first of all, Krishna explains the long-term effect of associating with a particular mode throughout one's life. That is the destination after death. He explains that if someone has associated with predominantly the mode of goodness during their life, then in their next life they will attain higher planets in this universe. Not spiritual planets, material planets within this universe, which provide a higher material experience. If one's predominantly associated with the mode of passion, one will, in the next life, reside in middle planetary systems such as this Earth planet. And if one is predominantly associated with the mode of ignorance, one will actually go down to animal species. Then Krishna explains results of action in the modes. So he explains both immediate effects and also medium-term effects. First, he explains the medium-term effects. So from goodness, the medium-term effect will be purity. So that is what one will attain in one's life. One will become pure. And then in passion, the medium-term effect is misery, because one is working so hard to fulfill desires that can never be fulfilled. In other words, the desire can never actually satisfy the soul. So one is miserable. And then the medium-term effect of the mode of ignorance is just foolishness. One becomes ignorant, more and more ignorant. And then the immediate effects of, say, a mode of goodness lifestyle is real knowledge. passion, the immediate effect is greed, because one doesn't have that real knowledge in the mode of goodness. So even though one has tried so hard to fulfill one's desires and they haven't satisfied the person doesn't think, well, maybe I should try another approach to satisfying myself. The person just thinks, I need more and more and more of what I've already got. So that's the immediate effect of the mode of passion. One becomes greedy. And then the immediate effect of the mode of ignorance, Krishna says, he says there's foolishness, madness, and illusion. So we can see that although all these three modes are ropes that bind us to the material world, relatively speaking, the mode of goodness is the most favorable for spiritual life, because the result of a mode of goodness lifestyle, as we hear in this section, is purity and also knowledge. So these are both essential for spiritual progress. One needs real knowledge and one needs a purified lifestyle and purified consciousness to make genuine spiritual progress. So for that reason, the mode of goodness is certainly the most favorable of the three, although all of them are actually still ropes that bind us to this material world. And we'll hear more about what a mode of goodness lifestyle looks like when we move on to chapters 16, 17, and 18. Now, the final section of the chapter, we hear about transcending the modes. And this section is introduced by Arjuna's questions. He asks 3 questions, but those questions are prompted by Krishna explaining the results of transcending the 3 modes. He says, when you're able to do that, you can become free from birth, death, old age, and all their distresses, and you can enjoy nectar or happiness, genuine happiness, even in this life. So naturally, after hearing this, Arjuna's thinking, well, how do I do it? How do I transcend the 3 modes of material nature? So he asks 3 questions in this regard. He asks, by what symptoms is a transcendentally situated person known? What is such a person's behavior? And how does one transcend the 3 modes? So Krishna answers these questions in the order that Arjuna asked them. First of all, he answers the question, what are the symptoms of a transcendental person? So this is how we can see subjectively if we have transcended the control of the 3 modes. Krishna says such a person does not hate illumination, attachment, and delusion when they are present, or long for them when they disappear. In other words, such a person is equipoised in all material circumstances. If we are not attached or averse to any material circumstance, then we can understand that we've transcended the influence of these 3 modes of nature. Next, Krishna answers Arjuna's second question about the behavior of a transcendental person. So this is how we can objectively see if someone has transcended the 3 modes. Krishna describes that such a person is unwavering and undisturbed, that such a person remains neutral and transcendental, regards alike happiness and distress, looks upon a lump of earth, a stone, and a piece of gold equally, is equal toward the desirable and the undesirable, is steady, is situated equally well in praise or blame, in honor or dishonor, who treats alike both friend and enemy, and has given up all material activities. So the last question is, how does one come to this position? Because without knowing the process of coming to this position, one can't show the symptoms. And Krishna answers, by pure bhakti yoga, one transcends the 3 modes of material nature. He says one who engages in full devotional service, unfailing in all circumstances, at once transcends the modes of material nature and thus comes to the level of Brahman. Srila Prabhupada says in his purport, this verse is a reply to Arjuna's third question, what is the means of attaining to the transcendental position? As explained before, the material world is acting under the spell of the modes of material nature. One should not be disturbed by the activities of the modes of nature. Instead of putting his consciousness into such activities, he may transfer his consciousness to Krishna activities. Krishna activities are known as bhakti yoga, always acting for Krishna. One who is engaged in the service of any of the forms of Krishna or of his plenary expansions is considered to be transcendentally situated. So if one engages himself in the service of Krishna or his plenary expansions with unfailing determination, although these modes of nature are very difficult to overcome, one can overcome them easily. This has already been explained in the 7th chapter. One who surrenders unto Krishna at once surmounts the influence of the modes of material nature. So Krishna says here that by full devotional service, in other words, uninterrupted devotional service or bhakti yoga, one comes to the level of Brahman. And by the term Brahman, he's referring to the impersonal manifestation of the Supreme, which is spiritual and is situated above the three material modes of nature. So by full devotional service, one comes to that platform, and as he explained at the end of the 11th chapter, such a person also realizes Krishna's personal form, which, as he explains in the next text, is the basis of that impersonal manifestation of the Supreme. He says, and I am the basis of the impersonal Brahman, which is immortal, imperishable, and eternal, and is the constitutional position of ultimate happiness. Again, this point that the impersonal manifestation of the Supreme is based on the personal manifestation. It takes a person to be impersonal, but how can something impersonal then become personal? Krishna made this point in the 7th chapter as well, and it's a common theme throughout the Gita. Let's summarize. In this chapter we learn how the living entities become conditioned by and liberated from the three modes of material nature. We hear how the three modes bind the pure soul, how to recognize a mode's supremacy, the results of acting and dying within the modes, how to transcend them, and the symptoms of one who has actually done so. To conclude, I'll read text 19 and Srila Prabhupada's purport. Krishna says, when one properly sees that in all activities no other performer is at work than these modes of nature, and he knows the Supreme Lord who is transcendental to all these modes, he attains my spiritual nature. Srila Prabhupada's purport. One can transcend all the activities of the modes of material nature simply by understanding them properly, by learning from the proper souls. The real spiritual master is Krishna, and he is imparting this spiritual knowledge to Arjuna. Similarly, it is from those who are fully in Krishna consciousness that one has to learn the science of activities in terms of the modes of nature. Otherwise, one's life will be misdirected. By the instruction of a bona fide spiritual master, a living entity can know of his spiritual position, his material body, his senses, how he is entrapped, and how he is under the spell of the material modes of nature. He is helpless, being in the grip of these modes. But when he can see his real position, then he can attain to the transcendental platform, having the scope for spiritual life. Actually, the living entity is not the performer of different activities. He is forced to act because he is situated in a particular type of body conducted by some particular mode of material nature. Unless one has the help of spiritual authority, he cannot understand in what position he is actually situated. With the association of a bona fide spiritual master, he can see his real position, and by such an understanding he can become fixed in full Krishna consciousness. A man in Krishna consciousness is not controlled by the spell of the modes of material nature. It has already been stated in the 7th chapter that one who is surrendered to Krishna is relieved from the activities of material nature. For one who is able to see things as they are, the influence of material nature gradually ceases. Here Srila Prabhupada stressing that it is by acquiring a genuine spiritual education through the authorized disciplic succession, as Krishna explained in chapter 4, that we can actually become free from the 3 modes of material nature. And in the next chapter he will also state a similar thing. He will say, Pashanti Jnana Chakshushaha, that those who see through the eyes of knowledge actually become free from the influence of material nature. And of course that knowledge is gained through the bona fide disciplic succession, as he explained in chapter 4. Let's have a preview of chapter 15. Chapter 15 is entitled The Yoga of the Supreme Person. In chapter 14, Krishna said that by performing Bhakti Yoga, one can transcend the 3 material modes of nature. However, to develop attachment and devotion to Krishna, one must also cultivate detachment from the material world. In chapter 15, therefore, Krishna explains the process of doing that. Thank you so much for joining me here in the course, Simple Gita, and I look forward to seeing you in this next class on chapter 15, the Yoga of the Supreme Person.